With a passive tree like this, Path of Exile seems like there would be hundreds of builds. And in fact, if you look it up, there do seem to be, based on melee, bow, spellcaster, lightning, fire, chaos. It seems like there's hundreds of builds, right? What if I were to tell you that if you really break things down, there are only 8 Path of Exile builds? Now, these 8 builds fall under 4 main themes, and you'll see that every skill and every setup will fall under these categories. First, I want to look at what would be an erroneous way to look at these builds. If you're creating your own build, this is how the game would present itself to seem. It would seem like, hey, we have these attack categories, spell, sort of proxy, which is like totems, brands, ballistas, traps, and mines, or minions, which scale off their own independent attributes as opposed to scaling off of your own, like the totems, traps, mines, and brands. And then you have the sort of AoE category, where you can do splash damage or explode damage. And then, of course, you have damage over time versus crit, melee versus projectile. These are not the 8 PoE builds. These are just tags. These are just partial scaling. If you follow this approach, this diagram, it's thicker than your mom's tits. It's an illusion. This is something that a novice or an intermediate player might do. They might just kind of pile on modifiers. So if you're doing something like Ice Shot, you'll say, okay, let me scale my cold, let me get my projectile attacks up. All very accurate, this tag-based approach. It'll get you through campaign, it'll get you through mapping. It'll kind of taper off around tier 16 maps. You'll hit a wall, and that's because really the game actually looks more like this. This is how I think of crafting my own builds. These, in my opinion, are the 8 actual builds of PoE. When it comes to proxy, in reality, brands, mines, totems, ballistas, they actually fall under the either crit or DOT categories, the way you want to scale. This is a scale-based approach as opposed to just a tag-based approach. And the proxy does include minions, in fact, but also corpse builds. And then you have this sort of stacking category. And trauma stacking setups are very unique the way they scale, and so they are really their own independent build. They can't quite be called attack, crit, or DOT. And then you have various affix stacking. And so here's a bunch of examples. For example, Bleed Bow, Toxic Rain would be an attack DOT. When it comes to category 2, you'll have like Essence Drain, Wintertide Brand, Righteous Fire, the spell DOTs. Category 3, if you want to scale attack and you want to generally focus in on really scaling your crit, which does not have a limit, which is why it has so much more potential than just scaling your tags. You have Cyclone or Ice Shot, for example. Now, I'm about to say something that's about to blow your mind. Resolute Technique and Precise Technique builds, which eliminate your crit, are actually crit attack builds because you're purposefully taking advantage of the crit concept to scale an alternate modifier. Mic drop, right? Category 4, the spell crit setups could be Spark. It could be something like Icicle Mine. In reality, mines, traps, they all are just variants of when you scale, in this case, a spell crit setup. Category 5, minions, independently scaling. It could be something like Spectres, it could be Carrion Golems, it could be an Arakali's Fang setup using the unique weapon. Corpse proxy skills are like Detonate, Dead, and Cremation. They're corpse life dependent. They're corpse life reliant, and so they scale differently. And then you have Stacking Trauma, which can be Bone Shatter, or it can be like using trauma support on a Glacial Hammer setup. And then affix stacking, and I call it this because it could be like a deck stacking Hollow Palm. It could be mana stacking for mana bond setups. It could be energy shield stacking, like the Ephemeral Edge unique. And so these are the 8 builds of PoE.